The train from Winnipeg arrived 40 minutes late, and by the time Mavis Colette stepped onto the platform at Cresthollow, the afternoon light had already turned the color of weak tea. She had one trunk bag and a letter folded. So many times the creases had gone soft and white. The letter was from Mr. Aldous Prentice, a land agent who had placed the advertisement in the Free Press the previous autumn house. Keeper sought, Prentice Ranch, Cresthollow, Manitoba. Room and board provided, references required. Apply in writing. She had applied. She had been accepted. She had not told him she was 24 years old and had never kept a house that wasn't her mother's. Her mother had been dead since February. The house had not been theirs to begin with. Cresthollow was smaller than she had imagined from the name. A grain elevator, a general store, a post office the size of a broom cupboard, and a hotel with 3 rooms that smelled of pipe smoke and old carpet. The station master, a small man with a magnificent gray mustache, pointed her toward a wagon already waiting at the far end of the platform. "That'd be the Prentice rig," he said. "He sends Collins for the supply run most Wednesdays. You can ride out with him." Collins turned out to be a boy of perhaps 16 with ears that stuck out beneath his hat brim. He loaded her trunk without a word, which she appreciated, because she was tired in a way that went beyond the hours of travel. She sat beside him on the bench and watched the town give way to road, the road give way to prairie, and the prairie open itself up in every direction like a question she didn't know how to answer. The ranch came into view after 40 minutes. It was not what she had pictured. Neither grand nor ramshackle, but something more considered than either. A white house with a wide porch, 2 barns, a fenced paddock where 4 horses stood in the golden hour light, cottonwood trees along the fence line, a kitchen garden that had been tended by someone who knew what they were doing, though the late-season growth was patchy and the beds could use turning. Collins pulled up to the house and climbed down to retrieve her trunk. The front door opened before she had gathered her bag. The man who appeared in the doorway was not what she had pictured either. She had imagined someone older, someone with a paunch and a Sunday suit, and the slightly harried manner of a widower who needed help. Mr. Aldous Prentice was perhaps 40, lean without being thin, with the kind of face the Manitoba wind had taken its time with. Sun-darkened, creased at the corners of the eyes, not handsome in any conventional sense but difficult to look away from. He stood with the stillness of someone who was accustomed to watching things without comment. "Miss Colette," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Prentice." He looked at her for a moment, not rudely, but with the measuring assessment of a man who had learned not to waste time. Then he stepped aside and held the door. "Collins will bring your things up. I'll show you the house." That was the beginning of it. Not romantic, not even particularly warm. Practical. Straightforward. A door held open, a trunk carried up, a kitchen shone with the same economy of words he seemed to apply to everything. The kitchen was clean but underused. A stove that needed blacking. Shelves that had been restocked recently but without any particular organization. A window above the sink that looked out onto the cottonwoods. He showed her the cold cellar, the root supply, the schedule he kept for the ranch hands' meals. There were 4 of them, including Collins, who slept in the bunkhouse. She would cook for all of them. She would keep the house. She would have Sundays free except for the midday meal. "And your own meals," he said, pausing in the doorway of the dining room. "You'll eat at the table with the men, or in the kitchen, if you prefer." "At the table is fine," she said. He nodded once, as if this had been a test she hadn't known she was taking, and moved on. Her room was at the back of the house, off the kitchen, with a window that faced east, a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the back of the door. On the windowsill, someone had left a smooth river stone pale gray and oval. She didn't know if it was meant to be there or simply forgotten. She left it where it was. The first weeks were harder than she let on. She had cooked for two, herself and her mother, in a house where the stove ran cold in the mornings and the pantry was never full. Cooking for 5 men with outdoor appetites was a different enterprise entirely. The first morning she underestimated the quantity of porridge by half and had to quickly fry extra bread while the hands waited with the patient tolerance of men who had experienced worse. Collins looked at his plate philosophically. The others said nothing. Mr. Prentice said nothing either, but she noticed that he had given his own extra portion to the youngest hand, a quiet boy named. She had to ask twice before she caught it. Teddy, who ate with the focused determination of someone who had not always had enough. She filed that away without examining it. She learned the kitchen by repetition and by asking Mrs. Dunbar, who ran the general store in town, on her weekly supply run. Mrs. Dunbar was a broad, efficient woman who gave advice the way she gave change, accurately and without sentiment. She told Mavis which cuts of meat the butcher held back for regular accounts, which flour brand held up in high-altitude baking. Not applicable to the flat Manitoba plains, but the principle of it stood, and that the Prentice kitchen had been run for 3 years by a woman from Ontario who had left to nurse a sick sister and not returned. Before her? Mavis asked. Mrs. Dunbar looked at her over a stack of tinned goods. His wife, she said simply, and did not elaborate. Mavis did not ask further. She had learned that information in small places carried its own weight, and it was rude to collect more than you needed. She began to find her rhythm. The mornings were her best time. Up before the hands, the stove lit, the house cold and quiet, and entirely hers for half an hour before the world required anything. She would stand at the kitchen window with her first cup of tea and watch the sky change color over the cottonwoods. The Manitoba dawn had a particular quality she had not known before, a wideness to it, as if the light had more room here than anywhere else. On those mornings, she was almost all right. She noticed things about him the way you notice things about the landscape, without deciding to, in the peripheral way of someone who is technically looking somewhere else. He was the first one up and the last one in, always. She would hear his boots on the porch, step in the dark, and know it was still an hour before she needed to rise. She would hear them again at night, long after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse. He did not sleep much, or he did not sleep when others did. She didn't know which. He checked the fences himself, rather than sending the hands, which surprised her until Mrs. Dunbar mentioned, without being asked, that he had lost cattle 2 autumns ago due to a fence the previous foreman had reported sound. He trusted his own eyes now, on the things that mattered. He left tools in better condition than he found them. She noticed this because he used the kitchen sometimes in the early morning. The large work table for a harness repair, the good light from the east window. He always wiped down the table afterward and replaced anything he had moved. He did not speak much at meals, but he listened. She learned this by watching. When one of the hands mentioned a problem with the north well, she saw Mr. Prentice's attention sharpen almost imperceptibly, even though he said nothing, until after the meal was cleared, when he went and looked at it himself. He had a dog, a rough-coated border collie named Soot, who followed him everywhere except the house. On cold mornings she had seen him crouch and rub the dog's ears with both hands, talking to the animal in a low voice she couldn't hear from the window. She stopped watching when she realized she had been standing at the glass too long. He called her Miss Colette, always. The formality of it was correct, and she was grateful for it. And she also noticed, in the peripheral way, that she had started listening for her own name at the breakfast table. The first real conversation they had, beyond the exchange of practicalities, happened because of the kitchen garden. She had been turning the beds in October, working the cold soil over with a fork in the thin late-season sun, when he appeared at the garden gate. He stood there in that particular way of his, unhurried, hat in hand, watching her work. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's not part of your duties." "I know." She turned another row. "But it'll be better in the spring if the soil is broken now. The beds on the west side have been compacted. Something heavy stood on them, I think." A pause. "Water trough used to sit there. That explains it." She rested the fork. "Whoever kept the garden before used raised beds along the south fence. The spacing is still visible. You'd get more sun on the root vegetables if you brought those back." He looked at the south fence, then back at her. "You know gardens. My mother did." She went back to turning the soil. "I know enough." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Then, "There are seed catalogs in the study. From last winter. I didn't order anything. You're welcome to look through them." "Thank you, Mr. Prentice." He put his hat back on and walked back toward the barn. She watched him go without meaning to, and then went back to the frozen earth. She found the catalogs that evening, stacked on the corner of his study desk, still rubber-banded from the post. Some of the pages had been turned down at the corners. She unfolded them carefully and saw what had been marked: root vegetables, cold hardy varieties, a winter squash she recognized from her mother's garden in Winnipeg. She sat with the catalogs for a long time in the lamplight, longer than she'd planned. Winter came in November that year, and meant it. The ranch settled into a different rhythm. The men indoors more, the days shorter, the mornings dark well past 7. She made heavier food, stews and roasted cuts, dense bread, pots of soup that lasted 2 days. The cold made people hungry in a different way, a more serious way, and she fed them seriously, on the worst nights. On the worst night, when the temperature dropped far enough that the pipes in the cold cellar needed watching, she would sometimes come downstairs in the small hours to find him already there. He never acknowledged these encounters directly. He would nod, she would nod, and one or the other of them would check the pipes and go back to bed. It became somehow a kind of companionship. One night in January, she couldn't sleep and came down to find him at the kitchen table, not tending the pipes, but simply sitting with a cup of cold coffee and what appeared to be a ledger, though he wasn't writing in it. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face, brief and unguarded before he composed it, was simply tired, not unhappy, just tired in the deep way of a man carrying something heavy for a long time. "Sorry," she said. "I heard a noise." "Wind," he said. "The east shutters working loose again. I'll fix it in the morning." She put the kettle on, without asking, and made 2 cups of tea, leaving his on the table without ceremony, and sitting down at the far end with her own. He looked at the cup, then at her, and then apparently decided to simply accept the situation. They sat in silence for perhaps 20 minutes. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had, through proximity and routine, stopped needing to perform ease for each other. She looked at the dark window. He turned a page in the ledger without reading it. When she stood to go back to bed, he said, "Miss Colette." She turned. "The soup today, the barley one." He paused in the manner of a man choosing words carefully from a small supply. It was very good. It was such a plain thing to say that she almost laughed. "Thank you, Mr. Prentice," she said instead, and went upstairs with her chest feeling strangely full. She did not examine the feeling. She was getting good at not examining things. The problem of Mr. Raymond Selkirk arrived in February, on a Thursday, with a good horse and a great deal of self-possession. He was a land investor from Portage la Prairie. handsome in the straightforward way of someone who had always known it, well dressed for the weather, with an easy manner and a confident voice that filled rooms. He had apparently met Mr. Prentice at a cattlemen's meeting in Winnipeg before Christmas and had been corresponding since about a parcel of land on the ranch's north boundary. He was invited to stay 2 nights while the details were discussed. He noticed Mavis, me, on the first evening, with the focused attention of a man who was accustomed to noticing things he wanted. She was accustomed to this, and handled it in the way she handled most things. Politely, without encouragement, with a composure that could be mistaken for coolness if someone was not paying close attention. She served supper, answered direct questions, and did not invite further conversation. Mr. Raymond Selkirk, however, was not a man who required invitation. At breakfast the second morning, he asked her where she was from, and she said Winnipeg. He said he had business there often and named a restaurant she might have visited. She said she didn't think she had. He laughed as if this were charming, and said he would have to take her there sometime. And she looked at her serving spoon with great focus and said nothing. After breakfast, she went to the kitchen garden to assess the winter coverage on the beds she had prepared in October, a task that required her presence outside and not in the dining room where Mr. Raymond Selkirk was spreading maps on the table and charming everyone within range. She stayed in the garden longer than was strictly necessary. When she came back in through the kitchen door, stamping snow from her boots, she nearly walked into Mr. Prentice, who was coming from the direction of the dining room at a pace that was slightly faster than his usual measured one. He stopped. She stopped. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "Miss Colette." He looked at her for a moment, one of those direct, measuring looks she had come to recognize. "Is everything all right?" "Perfectly, thank you." He held her gaze a moment longer than the question required, and then nodded once, slowly, and went out the back door. That evening, at supper, she noticed that Mr. Prentice placed himself at the table in a position that put him, without any apparent deliberateness, directly between her and Mr. Raymond Selkirk. She also noticed that he was slightly less quiet than usual, not talkative, never that, but present in a way that claimed the air of the room more than it normally did. He answered Selkirk's business questions directly and efficiently, and somehow, without any visible effort, kept the conversation from turning toward her again. Mr. Raymond Selkirk left the next morning in excellent spirits, having concluded an agreement on the north boundary land and, apparently undeterred by the household's collective atmosphere of quiet resistance. That afternoon, Mavis was in the kitchen making pastry when she heard the outside door, and then his footstep on the flagstones. She knew it by now, knew it the way you know a sound you've heard 1,000 times without thinking about it, and then nothing. He had stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "He's gone then?" she said. "Just now." A pause. "He asked me if you had any understanding with anyone." Her hands stilled in the flour, she made herself keep working. "What did you tell him?" The silence stretched long enough that she did turn then to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he had the expression of a man who had prepared for a conversation and was now uncertain how to begin it. "I told him the situation was not his business," Mr. Prentice said. It was not quite an answer to the question. She understood that he understood that she understood this. "That's reasonable," she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went back outside. She turned back to her pastry. Her hands were not quite steady. She did not examine why. March came in like a reprieve. The days lengthened. The snow softened at the edges. Soot began sleeping on the porch step again, instead of the barn, which Collins said was the most reliable weather sign on the property. Mavis planted the first cold hardy seeds in the beds she had prepared in October. Kneeling in the mud, with her skirt tucked up and her hands good and dirty, and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was closed. She had been here 6 months. She had not thought in terms of permanence when she arrived. She had thought in terms of surviving the winter, of earning her room and board, of keeping her head down and not asking for more than was offered. She had been a person who had lost everything that was hers and was trying very carefully not to need anything new. But the garden was hers now, in the way that things become yours when you have worked and tended and worried over them. The kitchen was hers in the same way. The east window in the morning, the particular quality of the light on the cottonwoods. Those were hers too. By now, she had not been careful enough. She was thinking about this in the garden one afternoon in early April when she heard footsteps and looked up to find not Mr. Prentice but Collins, slightly out of breath, hat in hand. "Sorry to bother you, Miss Colette. There's a fellow come up the road asking for Mr. Prentice. Says he has a letter for him from a Miss Colette in Winnipeg." She stood slowly, brushing mud from her knees. "A Miss Colette," she repeated. His words, "ma'am." She went inside and waited. The letter, it turned out, was from a cousin she had written to in December. A cousin who had heard she was in Manitoba and wished to reconnect, and also to tell her that a position had come available in Winnipeg at a girls' school, teaching domestic sciences, well paid, respectable. The cousin knew someone and could put in a word. She should write back by the end of the month if she was interested. She sat with the letter at the kitchen table for a long time. She was not sure what she felt about it. That was the honest answer. She had wanted to teach, once, before her mother's illness had made other things necessary. A position like this was not nothing. It was, on paper, exactly the kind of future she had been hoping for, before hope had seemed impractical. She folded the letter along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her apron. At supper, she was quieter than usual. She wasn't aware of it until Collins looked at her twice with a concerned expression which he was not generally given to. Afterward, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and she was washing up, she heard his footstep and then the sound of him pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. The chair at the near end, which was not the chair he usually chose when he sat in the kitchen. She did not turn around. "Something has come up," he said. It was not a question, a letter. She dried a cup carefully. A position in Winnipeg, a teaching post. The silence behind her had a different quality than usual. She placed the cup on the shelf. "Teaching," he said, "domestic sciences, at a girls' school." She turned then, because she was not a person who had conversations with her back to people if she could help it. He was sitting with his forearms on the table, looking not at her, but at the surface of the wood. "It's a good position, the kind of thing I'd hoped for once." He said nothing. He turned his hat over once on the table and then set it down. "Would you consider it?" he asked. His voice was careful in the way it was careful when something mattered. "I don't know," she said, and it was the truest answer she'd given anyone in months. "I've been happy here. I didn't expect that." She paused. "I'm telling you because you'd need time to find someone else." He looked up then, and she saw something in his face that she had caught glimpses of before and never been sure of. A seriousness beyond his usual gravity, a held quality, like a man standing at the edge of something. "Miss Colette," he said, and then stopped. She waited. She was good at waiting. "I would ask," he began, with the manner of a man approaching a difficult piece of work methodically, from the most practicable angle. "I would ask you to consider that whatever this post in Winnipeg offers, security, respectability, a future, I cannot provide less. I have good land. I have no debts. I am not," he paused. "I know I'm not easy to know, I'm told I am not. You're not difficult, she said, before she could stop herself. He looked at her steadily. I found my wife's death more than I knew how to manage. I spent a long time afterward deciding that some things were done and shouldn't be revisited. He turned the hat over again once. I would like to revisit my thinking on that point. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the last of the daylight was going off the cottonwoods. I've been watching you since September, he said. I want to be plain about this. Not in a way that I'm not willing to account for. In a way that you probably already know about, because you're not unobservant. The faintest alteration in his expression, not quite a smile, but near it. I noticed you were cold. In November. I had Collins order a better grade of wool from Gagnon's in town. It went in your wardrobe. I didn't. He stopped. I should have asked. She stared at him. She thought about the coat she had found, hanging on the hook on her door, in late November, folded over with a note that said from the supply account, for the cold which she had assumed was some standard ranch provision, and had worn every day since without question. That was you, she said. Yes. She absorbed this for a moment. The stone on my windowsill, she said. A beet. My daughter picked it. From the creek. She was 4. His voice was even, but the words cost something. She died the same winter as her mother. I didn't. He looked at the window. I moved it there in September. I don't know why. You can put it away. I won't put it away, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He looked back at her. The held quality in his face was more visible now, a man who had said what he needed to say and was waiting for the ground to settle under it. She thought about the catalog pages folded down at their corners. The table wiped clean. The chair placed between her and Mr. Raymond Selkirk, without any apparent forethought. The bowl of soup she had made on a cold Tuesday in January, and his face in the lamplight, tired and honest. She thought about the east window in the morning, and how it had become, without her deciding, one of the things she would be sorry to lose. Mr. Prentice, she said. Aldous, he said. If that's, you don't have to, but if we're talking plainly. She looked at him sitting at her kitchen table, his hat in his hands, asking for nothing more than honesty. I'll write to my cousin, she said slowly, and tell her I'm grateful and that I've made other arrangements. Something changed in his face. Very quiet, very thorough. All right, he said. I'll need to know, she said, that you'll let me keep the garden. He looked at her steadily. It's your garden, he said. It's been your garden since October. She had not expected that. She turned back to the shelf and put away the last cup, and her hands were perfectly steady, and she stood there an extra moment with her back to him, because she needed one breath that was entirely her own before everything that came next. They were married in June, at the small Anglican church in Cresthollow, in front of a congregation that included the 4 ranch hands, Mrs. Dunbar from the general store, and a handful of neighbors who had been watching the situation at the Prentice Ranch, with the patient interest of people who had correctly predicted the outcome from the beginning. Mavis wore a dress of soft ivory that Mrs. Dunbar had helped her choose from a catalog, and she carried nothing, because she had not had enough things in her life to be sentimental about many of them. Except the river stone from the windowsill, which was in the pocket of her dress the whole afternoon, and which she told no one about. Aldous stood at the front of the church, as though he had always been the kind of man who stood at the front of things, which she suspected was not true of him, and which moved her more than she could easily have explained. He held her hand through the whole service, with the focused certainty of a man who had decided, and was decided. 4 years later, on a September evening with the first hint of frost edging the air, Mavis Prentice sat on the wide porch of the house she had come to, in a state of uncertainty, and now could not imagine leaving. The garden was behind her, harvested and turned for winter, the beds covered in straw. Through the kitchen window came the smell of the bread she had started that morning, and, from the barn, came the sounds of Collins, older now, and the foreman proper, finishing the evening rounds. Teddy, who had grown nearly 6 feet and gone quiet in the particular way of young men who are becoming themselves, was somewhere in the paddock. Aldous came out of the barn and stood for a moment, looking at something in the distance. The north fence, she thought, or the sky above it, which had gone the color of river ice. Then he looked toward the house and saw her, and something in his bearing changed in the small way it always did when they moved within sight of each other. A settling, an arriving. He came up to the porch and sat beside her, and she handed him his tea, which she had made 5 minutes ago, because she had heard his boots on the barn floor and knew the timing. He looked at the cup, and she saw in his profile the same thing she had seen in the kitchen doorway on an October afternoon 4 years ago. When he had come to the garden to tell her she didn't have to work that hard, and she had worked that hard anyway. An attention, a quality of presence that had no name she knew except that it was directed at her. "Good day?" she asked. "North fence held," he said. Collins was right about the straining. He usually is now. Yes. He drank his tea. A pause. "The garden looks good for spring. It should." She looked at her hands in her lap, rougher than they had been in Winnipeg, stained in the permanent way of someone who worked with earth. "I'm putting in the heritage squash along the south beds, the kind from the catalog." He turned to look at her then, and she looked back, and he had the expression she had learned to read over 4 years. Not quite a smile, not quite anything so definite, but a warmth behind the composure that was only ever for her. "I know," he said. She laughed, which surprised her, the ease of it. "You read the seed order. You left it on the kitchen table." "I always leave it on the kitchen table. I always read it," he said. The sun went down behind the cottonwoods, and the light went gold, and then soft, and then the gray-blue of a Manitoba evening that she had come to love the way you love, a country that took you in when you had nowhere else to go. In the paddock, one of the horses moved and was still. They sat for a long time without speaking, and the silence was the same silence it had always been between them. Not empty, never empty, but full of everything that had already been said and all the years of small, true things that had not needed saying at all. That is what she understood later, when she tried to put it into words for herself, though she was not often given to that sort of accounting. That love, when it comes quietly, does not arrive all at once. It arrives the way a Manitoba winter gives way to spring, without announcement, a degree at a time, until one morning you look out the east window, and the ground is soft, and the cottonwoods have buds, and the world is already different, has been becoming different for some time, and you simply hadn't let yourself name it yet. She reached out and took his hand. He turned it over and held it the way he held everything that mattered, carefully, without show, as if he intended to keep it.